Welcome to another episode of the Michele Tafoya podcast. Love my guest today, Gerard Baker. He has granted me permission to call him Gerry Baker of the Wall Street Journal, has a new book out called American Breakdown. Let me read you one sentence. It's no accident that if you ask the leaders of the institutions that have seen the greatest declines in trust over the last 50 years, government, media, universities, big business, some version of Trump's to blame is probably the answer they would give to the question of why trust has declined. It's not their fault. It's all the fault of some malevolent, lying narcissist, some serpent-like creature who corrupted America's Garden of Eden. He writes brilliantly. He joins us next.
Welcome to the Michele Tafoya podcast.
People don't trust me anymore, and it's all their fault. It's a great quote out of the book American Breakdown by Gerry Baker, Gerard Baker from the Wall Street Journal. He's our guest coming up. So much of his book is about how trust has been lost in the great institutions of America. And it makes you feel very discouraged, but there's a silver lining in the book. He offers solutions. This is a very real issue in America. We don't trust our government. Why? Because they lie to us. We don't trust big business. Why? Because they lie to us. We don't trust the media. Why? Because they make up stories. And we don't trust academia. Why? Because they're teaching stuff they're not teaching our kids to read, and they're teaching them instead that their identity is the most important thing about them. So there's a lot of mistrust and distrust to go around. And by the way, Gerry Baker defines those two, mistrust versus distrust, in his book. It's just such a good read, American Breakdown. He's going to join us next. But what about your skin's breakdown? Do you think your face enjoyed the summer as much as you did where you're out in the sun and the humidity? Here's Ella from Rockford, Illinois. Quote, I have both age and acne spots, and this stuff is actually fading both of them. This serum is worth every penny. So what is she talking about? She's raving about the dark spot corrector from Genucel, a must-have after months of record heat and humidity this summer. You've got your sunspots, your brown spots, your discoloration, red splotches. They all can disappear in front of your eyes. No, I'm not kidding. Here's the Genucel amazing guarantee. Yes, I said guarantee. You'll see results day one or your money back. So take advantage of the Genucel most popular package, which now includes the dark spot corrector, plus the classic Genucel bags and puffiness treatment and immediate effects, all at about 70% off. So you can try the best skincare on the planet, and you can do it completely risk-free. Genucel has been in business for over 20 years, and they beat the competition in customer loyalty by about 300%. I'm telling you, it's simple. Go to genucel.com/Michele. Go there today. Start looking years, maybe even decades younger. Genucel. That's GENUCEL.com/Michele. Say goodbye to the dark spots, the liver spots, the bags and puffiness under the eyes, crow's feet at genucel.com/Michele. Genucel.com/Michele. You'll see results day one, and you'll get compliments everywhere you go. And that's also a guarantee. Genucel.com/Michele. Genucel.com/MICHELE, 1L. Gerry Baker is next about his new book, American Breakdown. Gerry Baker, welcome back to the podcast. So glad to have you. I think you can tell a lot by America about the films that were released in particular eras. And I know that your first visit here to the United States was 1986, and I looked it up, and the top films in 86 were Little Shop of Horrors, The Money Pit, Three Amigos with Steve Martin, Milo and Otis, The Money Pit, a lot of good fun, right? Short Circuit. And then 10 years later, you moved here, and the top films were James and the Giant Peach, Titanic, The Birdcage, Waiting for Guffman, The Cable Guy, Twister, a lot of fun stuff with very little political baggage in them.
Yeah.
I think we see a very different landscape today. Do you agree that that tells us a little something about the culture we're in? That's okay. I just dropped something. It's all right.
That's all right. Thanks. First of all, Michele, thanks again for having me on the podcast. I love your podcast. It's a great pleasure to be here. You do a great job. It's a really interesting observation that, Michelle, and I hadn't actually thought of it in those terms, but I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think if I've actually written a little bit in the past about the way Hollywood in particular has gone from being essentially a kind of, a business that's a cultural activity that kind of fairly reflected, I think, the values of America. You go back, whether back in, the 40s, the great war movies of the 40s, or the
Right.
great musicals, or great dramas of the 1950s and 60s, and there was an increasingly important political dimension, but there was never this kind of relentless sense that of America as a deeply flawed, corrupt, dysfunctional, terrible country, which I'm afraid is the kind of character of movies that have been made in the last 10 or 15 years. And so it's a very interesting way of thinking about it, Michelle. You're right. As you say, I first came to this country in 1986. Reagan, it was we're into the second term of Reagan. The country was doing very well. It was kind of morning in America. There was a sense that, things were on the up, and that was reflected, I think, in the culture of the time. And in the 1990s, when I came to move here, I moved to Washington in late 1996. It was just Bill Clinton had just been re-elected. We were before the Monica Lewinsky trauma that we were all put through before that. But it was also, and I quite often reflect on the 1990s as a time of real sort of the pinnacle of American achievement and success. The Cold War was over. The economy was booming. Inflation was relatively low. The internet was just taking off. There was this incredible sense that America had really demonstrated to the world the superiority of its model, the superiority of its values. It had defeated all comers in the 20th century. People talked about the end of history, all of that stuff, which sadly didn't turn out to be true. And I think just, again, and this is the thrust of my book, Michelle, think about how in just a generation, we've lost that. And again, not everybody liked Bill Clinton. I wasn't a big fan of Bill Clinton, certainly not his personal behavior.
Right.
But you go back and look at where America was in the late 1990s, post-Cold War, winning hot wars in Iraq and Kosovo, as I say, all of the economic success it was having, and the level of general sense of cohesion and purpose about the country was extraordinary at the time. And that in a generation has just been lost.
That is what's so astonishing, is how quickly this seems to have happened. And certainly we can point to moments like George Floyd, like the pandemic in recent years, that seem to have been opportune times to really get people to sort of put their stakes in the ground and argue about stuff, cultural stuff. But this idea of, the patriarchy and white supremacy and those kinds of identity politics that have been really starting to crop up seem to be a large part of this. The first chapter of your book really talks about trust and how much trust has been lost in so many institutions. And as I was reading it, I was thinking to myself, even the things that, the studies now that come out to talk about the loss of trust, can I trust those studies to be telling me the truth? I don't know whom to believe anymore. What do you think the genesis of this is?
Well, I think the main genesis is, unfortunately, people have been lied to for so many years. I mean, that is, I wrote the book about trust and about the collapse of trust based on all the data that we have about how much, public trust in major American institutions has fallen dramatically in the last 30 years. But in a sense, it's not a crisis of trust. It's not that the American people have just suddenly, for no reason, withheld their trust from institutions like the media, higher education, government, law enforcement, big business, science, technology, all those things that I look at in the book. It's that those institutions have themselves forfeited that trust, Michelle. It's that they've told us things that we have had reason to doubt, or frankly had reason to discover were just not true. And again, whether that's the government is responsible for a lot of that, I'm sorry to say, but a lot of what the government told us in the early 2000s about, the war on terror, about the war in Iraq, and I, by the way, let me say immediately, I was a strong supporter of the war in Iraq, but we were told things that weren't true. No wonder people don't trust in what the government says about things that are going on in the world, particularly like Ukraine right now. Again, I'm a supporter of what the administration is doing in Ukraine, but so many people have seen the government essentially tell them untruths over the last 20 years. So the government's lost its credibility. The media, what you and I work in, Michelle, have dramatically lost their credibility. That
Yes.
in the 1970s, after Watergate, something like 3/4 of Americans said they generally trusted what they read in news organizations. That number's down below 20% today, and again, understandably, because we've seen news organizations pursue these ideological views, dressing it up as news when people can see, and thanks to the internet in particular, that's one of the big things that's contributed to this, they can now test what they read or see on television against what they get, where they get alternative sources of information, and they can see the bias, they can see the way that people are being willfully misled, where the organizations are willfully misleading people. So, that's gone. We've had the pandemic. Trust was, weakened in the medical profession, in public health during the pandemic, in scientists. We had scientists, telling us on the one hand that you couldn't go out and protest against lockdowns or because that was a public health danger. But not only could you go out and protest, over the George Floyd murder, protests against supposed police brutality, but actually it was necessary to go out and protest. That was an act that was designed that actually would improve public health. Well, no wonder people don't trust. No wonder people stop trusting Anthony Fauci and the medical establishment, because they were telling us these things that were just, so obviously not true. So, we have over this period of 20, 25 years, Michelle, again, you just started off talking about the 1990s, we've seen institution after institution essentially fall to what I describe as an elite with values that are completely out of touch, that actually are contrary to American values, historical values, and have tried to turn the country, and basically turn the country against itself. And it's for that reason that I think trust has collapsed so dramatically.
When we talk about that country turning against itself, and I see it regularly, and I wonder if this is so intentional, if this started, as some people suggest, back in the 20s with Marxist folks coming into this country and starting this programming, if you will, or if this is just really what people believe, and that they think they can make this place so much better without any real knowledge of what the rest of the world looks like. I wonder what they think better actually looks like.
Yeah. I think a few trends have been in place. Again, some of the things you described, Michelle, a few trends have been in place that explain this, the way in which these elites have taken over these institutions. You're absolutely right. I think a lot of it does go back, especially in education, to a kind of Marxist class. What was interesting about, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1990, and China was essentially becoming, embracing sort of capitalist ideas, at least in the economy, and actually starting to grow. Marxist economic ideas were thoroughly discredited. I mean, we'd had 100 years, as you say, of sort of the march of Marxist ideologues through our institutions, through many of our academic institutions. We'd had this sort of tension throughout the Cold War between, was Marxism a better way for the world to work, or was capitalism and freedom? Anyway, well, that was really resolved with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and with the realization in China that they had to embrace free market reforms. So what happened? So these Marxists then, they didn't really want to let go of their ideologies. They changed it from the economic field to the cultural field, and essentially saying, okay, well, maybe the idea that the world is made up of an economic structure whereby capitalists are exploiting workers, maybe, okay, that idea wasn't so good, but we've got an alternative model for you, which is based on race and gender, and this idea of, critical theory, this fundamental idea that society operates with these power structures, exercised, by white male patriarchy in particular, and everybody else, in this sort of intersectional theory is somehow the victims of that oppression. So the sort of Marxism lived on. Another factor, and in fact, Marxism lived on and sort of reinvented itself in the kind of post-Cold War period and became so widely believed. A second factor, I think, really played a big role in the dilution or the collapse of trust in American institutions driven by these elites pursuing their own objectives was globalization. This became the mantra after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, that the world was coming together. It was, that we'd had periods like this in the past in the world, but this was seemed much more intense. As I say, the old Cold War barriers had broken down. China was emerging into the world economy. You had this kind of Davos man phenomenon of people, going to, Davos every year, the famous World Economic Forum, and talking about the virtues of an integrated world. And what they meant by that was essentially an integrated world that would work for big business, and that would be, borderless sort of trade, borderless movements of labor, meaning immigration, unlimited immigration. This became a dominant sort of theory, almost a theology among the kind of ruling classes on both sides of the political spectrum. It's really important to say that. Democrats embraced globalization as enthusiastically as Republicans had previously done, and Republicans embraced it too. And what that ignored was the damage that globalization did to communities here at home, whether it was the loss of jobs, whether it was the impact of immigration, whether it was the sort of cultural decline that was represented by all of that, and what the way that the form that commitment to globalization also then took was the idea that the nation state was somehow, invalid or somehow illegitimate, and that we had no right to keep people out. We had no right to assert our national values because we were all part of one great global community where we would all just, we'd all live happily ever after. And so and American values are so distinctively American. America was the country that was founded as an ideal, a country where people came here, to enjoy their freedom, to enjoy the economic opportunities that they could have. These elites became actually hostile to that very idea because no, American idea, because we now believe in this globally connected world, American values are no better than European values, right, or even Chinese values, or values of those people who are in the Middle East. And I think this elite, which took control then of the media, took control of our universities, took control of much of our permanent government, took control of big business, these ideas, essentially transformed the people the institutions that these people controlled into these agents of values that were just not American fundamentally. And so I think it's those two of the things I identify most in the book as having contributed to this trend of this extraordinary rapid seizure of the major institutions by these elites, and why they have pushed those institutions away from the values that actually most Americans have long held, and actually the values that have genuinely made America great.
It is stunning to me how we can look at the world and suggest that all countries share the same ideals and we're all equal. And, there is not a such thing as American exceptionalism, which I think Barack Obama intimated in some comments of his during his presidency. Yeah. When you see that other countries, and China, foremost among them, has an abysmal record of human rights. We continue to do our manufacturing there. We continue to rely on them for production of stuff that is regularly sold here. When at any time, they are so hostile to America, they could say, you know what? Maybe we'll just unleash a virus. I'm just suggesting that. Or maybe we'll stop exporting what it is that you need in this kind of Cold War way. Now we've got China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran forming this, what are some people are calling this new axis of evil. How badly did we underestimate China's power in this whole sort of hierarchy of terrible stuff?
The embrace of China was which characterized again both political parties after the end of the Cold War, characterized the way big business went about relation to China, was a mistake. It wasn't necessarily a mistake in terms of its economic opportunities. China's a growing economy, rapidly growing economy. It was a good thing that China was liberalizing its economy, that it was growing markets. That was a good thing. Were opportunities. Many people benefit from. Look at our iPhones, Michelle.
Right.
Most of our iPhones are made in China. They're great devices which we all love. So there's definitely economic benefits from this relationship. The problem, Michelle, was the way in which it was done, and in particular the assumptions, which I would say at best were naive and at worst were positively treasonous, about what the United States could achieve by this engagement. The idea that so many people had, presidents from Bill Clinton through George W. Bush and Barack Obama, based their engagement with China on the idea that, oh, China's going to be like us. China's going to be, the more we engage with them, China's going to become a democracy. And that's the surest way to ensure that we don't have conflict with China if we're all democratic. We're all basically following the same values. That was an incredibly naive thing to think and believe. Again, you might have been forgiven for thinking it. I think, this idea emerged with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union practiced communism for 70 years. It had failed. Gorbachev had introduced, perestroika and glasnost, a bit of opening of society and economic restructuring. That had failed completely. The idea was that China was now embracing economic liberalism. It was embracing economic markets, and that inevitably that would either collapse or it would have to involve the opening of society too. China would become more democratic. That was the assumption. It was just wrong, and it was clearly wrong from quite an early stage. We, admitted China to the WTO at the end of the 1990s. China was going to do its own thing. It was liberalizing its economy, but it was also playing by its own rules. I mean, it was, stealing our intellectual property.
Right.
It was demanding companies transfer their technology into China before, if they were to do business there. It was treating, foreign companies, US companies, very unevenly in terms of the way they were allowed to operate there and kind of the regulations they were subject to. But we just said, okay, that's fine. We're just going to let them go on doing that. And at the same time, of course, we, all of this was helping China develop militarily and politically and become an incredibly powerful rival to the United States. So we, in the pursuit of what was seen as economic advantage, we made terrible mistakes in the way that we allowed China basically to fleece us repeatedly. And as you know, Michelle, I'm not the biggest fan of Donald Trump. I think a lot of what Donald Trump says and does is not particularly desirable, but I will give him credit for this. When he came in 2017 as president, he said that's going to stop. We're going to stop treating China as though, as though they're playing by the rules, as though they really are our friend in all of these things, as though somehow engaging with them is going to be of universal benefit for Americans. We're not. We're going to start imposing our own, respecting our own interests, imposing our own demands, and making sure that we're looking out for our own people in this relationship with China. That was very important. And actually, I give some credit to the Biden administration for following on in that. But that was a terrible mistake, Michelle, that was made, over a 20-year period from the 1990s up until the mid-teens.
Yeah, and we've the International Olympic Committee, of course, has allowed 2 Olympic Games to occur in Beijing since that time. American Breakdown is the name of the book by Gerard Baker. Given this discussion on China, and you can say the Biden administration has continued with Trump's sort of stance on this, but Biden went to the G20 over the last week and stood there and sort of apologized for China and said, we don't want to hurt China. We want China to be economically strong. He kind of seemed like an ally to China in that moment, and it looked very weak, in my opinion. Yeah. So as I'm very public too, that I'm not a huge fan of Donald Trump. Some of his policies I definitely agree with, but I'm even less of a fan of Joe Biden. And this stance, this weak demeanor that he projected in talking about China. What do you think? What kind of message did that send the rest of the world, do you think?
I think you're right. I think it did look weak. I think the problem with this administration, just said I like some of the things they've done with regard to China. I like, for example, trying to build alliances against China, this deal with Japan and Korea that they just struck, the deal with Australia and the UK for submarine, essentially kind of to build up submarine presence in the Pacific. That's good, and they've done good things there. The problem, though, Michelle, and you hit the nail on the head here with this weekend's G20 meeting, is the mixed signals that they're sending. So on the one hand, they say, we're going to stand up, we're going to defend Taiwan. China's not going to be allowed to have its way. We're going to, we regard them as a strategic rival. We're building up our defenses, we're building up our capabilities, we're building up these alliances. But on the other hand, you have Biden going there and saying things like that. We don't see confrontation, we don't see containment of China. Or he has his various cabinet members. We've seen a succession of cabinet members go there in the last few months saying, we want a positive relationship with China. We want a warm relationship. We want a good we want economic collaboration with China. The problem with that is the Chinese aren't stupid. They see this. I think they look at the United States. They look at the divisions in the United States. And they look at this president in particular, and I'm sorry to say, a president who is, obviously very advanced in age and clearly with diminished capabilities, and they think there are opportunities, there are weaknesses there. Americans don't, they talk about, defending Taiwan, they talk about standing up for freedom, but actually, we just basically took over Hong Kong. China, the Chinese, just took over Hong Kong, having made all these promises that Hong Kong would be free. Nobody lifted a finger to stop us. You have the Biden administration coming and telling us that they want a good relationship with us. They see this and they think, you know what? They're not serious about really standing up against us. They're really not. They don't have the political will to do it. They don't have a president who really has the sort of political strength to do it. And they don't, in the end, have the will and the resolve as a nation to do it. So we're going to carry on doing what we want to do. The administration has to send clearer signals about about its refusal to accept what China is doing in two countries that matter enormously to us, to our allies in the region. We have to take a stand. And unfortunately, the Biden administration, too often, one day it will seem to be taking a stand, and the next day it will seem to be saying, actually, you know what? We really want a good relationship with China. We don't want any confrontation. And the Chinese just see weakness.
Just a couple hours before you and I sat down to record this podcast, Speaker of the House Mike McCarthy announced that the next logical step in this whole investigation into Hunter Biden and maybe potentially President Joe Biden's interactions with international monetary stuff. I'm trying to put this in simple terms.
Yeah.
Is to do an impeachment inquiry. And again, this is different from an impeachment, and people need to understand that the inquiry simply allows Congress access to more in-depth, really gives them the peak of their powers to look at the information that's out there. Is it fair to question? It's ridiculous that I just said, is it fair to question? But this is where we are in America, like you're not allowed to question. But is it logical to question Joe Biden's stance on China when his son, whom he's very proud of, seems to have benefited monetarily a great deal from a relationship with China? Is it possible the president is compromised?
Those are questions that are perfectly reasonable to ask and that an investigation presumably can dig into. Look, I find it implausible, but lots of implausible things have happened, so I don't say that out of any great authority. But I find it implausible that Joe Biden or any president of the United States would literally, subordinate the national security of the United States against the greatest strategic rival, the greatest strategic threat the United States has faced since the Cold War, possibly the greatest strategic threat the United States has faced to itself and its national security in its history, which is what China very possibly represents. I find it just implausible that Joe Biden would subject that priority, that objective, to the possibility that his son may have made 5, 10, how many millions of dollars, here and there. The problem, so I find that. So that's not to say I think it's inconceivable, but I think and it's reasonable to investigate it. But the bigger problem, Michelle, and here's where I think is why investigations really are warranted, is it's just. It seems to me pretty obvious now from what we know, and we probably don't know the half of it yet. There's a lot more I suspect we're going to learn. That, Joe Biden at minimum knew what his son was doing. And by the way, I will tell you this. When I was a reporter, actually when I was an editor, a journal editor a few years ago, during the Obama administration, the second term of Barack Obama, I remember talking to senior officials in the State Department who said to me, Hunter Biden's a real concern. He's constantly going around the world selling himself, and, we don't know if he's actually selling access to his father. At least they said that to me, but he's certainly selling his name and he's certainly making money out with foreign governments and foreign companies on the basis of that. They knew that back in 2013, 14, 15, 16, Michelle, in the second Obama term. The idea that Joe Biden didn't know anything about it is absolutely absurd. Yeah. First of all, we're now seeing more and more evidence that he was involved in some way. He may have, again, we'll have to see what the reality is, but there's plenty of persuasive evidence that he was involved in some of these discussions. He might have been on the phone, called in on the phone by Hunter to sort of, for Hunter to make his case. But secondly, it just defies belief that the vice president of the United States that his son is going around the world raising money on the basis of his name, and the vice president knows nothing about it. Particularly, the senior members of that administration were expressing concerns about it. And I'll say one other thing too, Michelle. This is more than just the son doing stuff and the troubled son. We've heard all about that, obviously, and he clearly is a troubled man, all kinds of flaws. But it's more than just the son, because in the end, they're kind of inseparable. I mean, we all know this, Michelle. I've got kids. If my kids are going out and raising huge amounts of money, from various, I hope they're not. I don't think they are. Sadly, I wish they were raising more money, but they're not. But if they were going out raising huge amounts of money, especially from questionable sources, it would make me better off. But I mean, it would just make me better off financially. There isn't a sort of rigid separation in any family between the son and the father, or the daughter and the father, and the daughter and the mother, or whatever. The family would be benefiting from that, especially Hunter with all of his problems that he was having and the challenges that he was posing to his father. The fact that he was being given huge amounts of money, essentially, as far as we can tell, to do basically nothing, was enormously beneficial to Joe Biden. There's no point in pretending otherwise. So the corruption question is a real one. I don't think you have to demonstrate at all that Joe Biden was the big guy, as some of those emails famously said, or was directly involved in siphoning off whatever millions there were. That might be the case. I don't know. I don't think you have to prove that to demonstrate that the way he behaved in tolerating his son's solicitation of these large amounts of money around the world was unacceptable for a senior member of the second ranking official in the administration at the time. That is unacceptable behavior. That would be unacceptable in a corporation. Michelle, most corporations have ethics rules about family members going out and using connections that they have within the company to go and raise money for themselves, and it's absolutely unacceptable in the federal government in Washington. So yeah, I think the stench of corruption is real, and I think the need for an investigation is a powerful one.
American Breakdown is the book. It is a fantastic read. I can't recommend it enough. I also think it's inconceivable, by the way, Joe Biden has this habit of saying, I never talked to my son about this, or I never knew about this, or I never, making it this extreme denial of knowing anything about his son, and yet he's around his son all the time. I mean, it's just it's consistent with Joe Biden and his inability to tell the truth all the time, and so often actually lie. And I hate using that word, but I think it's appropriate in this case because clearly he has said so many things that turned out to be false. He has plagiarized. We know all of this in looking back at Joe Biden.
Look, we're speaking on the day after the 9/11.
Yes.
He was at it again yesterday, saying that he was in New York the day after 9/11. No, nobody was, President Bush didn't get to New York until 3 days after that.
Exactly. It was too toxic.
It's these things. Yeah, absolutely. There's no credibility there.
No, there's none. And that's why when we look back on all of these statements and these powerful denials, you have to question every single one of them. So it's like you said, there is mistrust and distrust, and you go and explain the difference of those in your book, the terminology between those two things. But at this point, I feel distrust for this president.
I mean, it's not. I totally agree. I'm sorry to say this again, as somebody, part of the book is about how do we rebuild trust, and I think it's really important we do. But every time you have a president who opens his mouth and says something that people know is not true, now whether that's outright lying, which a lot of it may be, whether it's senility on his part, whether it's dementia, all of these things, but one way or another, he's telling us things that we know are not true. One of the things I find fascinating, Michelle, is this attempt by much of the media to kind of cover for Joe Biden's, misstatements, gaffes, whatever you want. It's funny that there was another piece in the New York Times today, actually just on Tuesday, about how, in fact, Biden had an incredibly successful visit, G20, lots of great meetings, everything went really well. Then he had this rather stumbling press conference, which went okay, but he had a couple of things and it had to be cut short. But the story is the real Joe Biden is incredibly successful and focused and capable. And they're asking people to believe what we see every time Joe Biden gets on a bike or tries to walk across a stage or opens his mouth, which is not when it's not absolutely scripted for him. The American people, the world can see this man is stumbling very, very badly.
Very
Whether that's
badly.
age or whatever else, he is stumbling very, very badly. They're asking us to believe that somehow that only happens when he's speaking in public, when he's performing in public. The rest of the time, he's laser focused and achieving everything. This nonsense that we hear from Corinne Jean-Pierre that he works harder. He wears his staff out with his energy.
They can't keep up with him.
That's why people don't trust government, because they know that is nonsense. And also, it's an unnecessary lie. You don't have to say. We all know the man is 81 years old and is an old man. You don't have to say, as a 40-year-old press secretary, "Wow, he's got more energy than I have," because that instantly makes you incredible. You just say, he's in charge. He does a good job. He focuses on what he needs to focus on. He makes all the key decisions. But instead, they have to embellish it with this sort of rubbish.
It's exactly right.
Why people don't trust them.
All right. And it's like he embellished all his corn pop stories and all the others. I mean, this isn't just within the last several years. This goes back decades with Joe Biden of mistruths and misrepresentations of his life. And it's embarrassing. And it's so frustrating to me too. And quite frankly, I'm a little scared by it because the state of the nation right now is so bad.
Right.
And I don't know, clearly Joe Biden's not running the country. So I'm not really sure who it is that's making all these decisions that are leading to such disastrous results.
Yeah.
I'll give you the final word on that.
It's a fair question. And again, I'm sorry to keep coming back to my book and the title of my book or the theme of my book, but it's about trust. It's no wonder, as you say, not only do they not trust what they're being told because they know that what they're being told, American people know that what they're being told is false, but as you say, we don't know who really is in charge. I mean, how can you trust a government when you don't really know who's making this? We supposedly live in a democracy, Michelle, where we elect our leaders and we expect our leaders to be accountable to the rest of us. When you have a president who plainly is not, for as far as we can see with our own eyes, is not capable of focusing on most of these important issues, we have a legitimate question, which is who's making these decisions? And if we don't know that, how on earth do we trust or hold people accountable for what they're doing and saying when we don't really know who is making the key decisions?
Right.
It's just another example of the way in which people are losing faith in these critical institutions that control the way the direction of the country.
American Breakdown is the name of the book. It is a fantastic read. I can't recommend it enough. Gerry Baker, I appreciate your time as always, and thank you so much. All the best with the book. I can't imagine it's not going to be a success because it is so important for the moment. The discussion about trust and faith in our institutions, it's critical. Thank you so much for your time.
Michelle, it's a real pleasure. Thank you very much for having me again.
Likewise, he is Gerard Baker. We get to call him Gerry. The book is American Breakdown. Thanks for listening, everyone. Be brave, do good, and we will see you next time.
Questions about the president's age often go hand in hand with questions about how you would step in the role, if necessary. Do you feel prepared for that possibility? And serving as vice president prepared you for that job?
Yes.
And how would you describe that process?
Which process?
Like as far as being ready for that.
Well, first of all, I'm answering your hypothetical, but Joe Biden's going to be fine, so that is not going to come to fruition. But let us also understand that every vice president understands that when they take the oath, that they must be very clear about the responsibility they may have to take over the job of being president. I am no different.